The VIDC acts as a think tank and also as an agent for social and political change through public education and awareness raising. So in our panel discussions and conferences, we tackle international politics, human rights violation, gender inequalities, and we also deal, for instance, with interlinkages between migration and development or tax policies and development. And besides that, we have a long tradition in cooperating very closely with migrant organizations, predominantly of African diasporas, but since a couple of years, we also attract the attention of communities, of Turkish and Afghan communities through our panel discussions. The purpose of this workshop is to better understand the interconnectedness of migration control, criminal justice, and human trafficking, and to become aware of the pitfalls of one-dimensional and short-sighted policy solutions. In particular, we will assess, with the help of our distinguished speakers sitting next to me, the effects of restrictive migration, asylum, and border control policies on the vulnerability of migrant and refugees to exploitation and trafficking. And in the next step, we will try to find solutions by putting the rights of victims in the center and by exploring what a human rights-based model to human trafficking looks like and which parameter it is built upon.
Okay, then, so we've spent quite a lot of time talking about Syrian refugees and other refugees from other conflict zones. And I just thought I'd try and switch across a bit to talk about groups that might more generally be categorized as economic migrants, although the boundary between so-called forced migration and so-called economic migration is difficult and problematic. But I'll use the example from a very brilliant anthropologist, Sini Plambec, who has been doing work, a project called Sex Work and Trafficking from the Global South, which looks at women's migration from Edo State in Nigeria. Plambec writes, but she was stopped at the airport. Nigerian border control officers are trained by European police officers to detect counterfeit documents, and in particular to prevent women who are under suspicion of travelling via a trafficking network. The women are stopped before they get on the plane, and this causes great frustration, costing them a ticket and the chance to reach Europe. They're often placed in counter-trafficking centres in Nigeria, paid for by donations from European countries in an attempt to make them give up their dream of Europe. But she says that didn't stop Becky. It meant that she couldn't get on the plane, and so she chose a longer and much more dangerous and expensive journey through the Sahara Desert. And Becky was somebody who knew that she was going to sell sex to make money when she went to Europe, and she said, you know, that other women, if you don't want to sell sex, then stay away from Europe. But still, she didn't give up her dream of going to Europe, and she tried again through the desert. And she was going to have to pay 60,000 euros, but then was offered the opportunity to make this crossing for 30,000 euros if she would travel around Edo State and find five other women to bring along. So she became an agent and a smuggler herself. And Simbach notes that women are not just passive in this process, that research shows that women take part in this and other parts of the migration industry. Now, in the end, her third attempt to reach Europe didn't succeed. She had to turn around and she was stopped in Niger. On the way back, she got pregnant. The baby died in her womb and she died because the doctor's attempts to get the baby out in a worn-down clinic failed. Becky died of something as common as pregnancy, just like her friend in the desert. I guess that if what we're concerned about is policies from a human rights perspective, then I think those sorts of stories must lead you to question what the sorts of policies that are currently being pursued are doing to protect a woman like Becky, who was 28 years old when she died. You know, what were the policies that would have protected her or saved her life?
In Lebanon, there are about 200,000 migrant women coming to Lebanon to work as live-in domestic workers in Lebanese households. They're mostly coming from Ethiopia, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And many studies show that they work for very long hours. They often face non-payment of wages or irregular payment of wages, and they face emotional abuse as well as physical and sexual abuse. So the recruitment process, plus the sponsorship system, plus the working and living conditions in Lebanon, all of this make this group, a huge group of migrant domestic workers in Lebanon, make them vulnerable to exploitation and trafficking. But I want to focus more about another form of trafficking that nobody is really talking about. It's the trafficking of migrant women into the sex industry in Lebanon through something called the artist visa scheme. Every year, there are around 5,000 to 6,000 women, mainly coming from Eastern Europe countries such as Moldova, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, entering Lebanon via the artist visa scheme issued by immigration authorities. And they're allowed to stay in Lebanon only for 6 months. And they're only allowed to work inside the super nightclub sector. So the immigration authorities in Lebanon control the stay of these women and dictate, according to a set rules and directives, their living and working conditions. This is typically what happens to a person holding the so-called artist visa in Lebanon. After arriving to the Lebanese territory, the club owner takes away the passport of the woman and makes her undergo right away a medical examination at the immigration authority. She's tested for STDs and pregnancy. If the results are positive, she's deported right away. If it's negative, the woman has to sign a work contract with the super nightclub owner under the supervision of the authorities. And she's briefed by the authorities that she shouldn't engage in prostitution because prostitution is illegal and she faces penalization and deportation. The contract she signs is a standard contract that all artists have to sign. It does not include a single right for the woman, except stating the amount of the salary and the nature of work, which, according to the contract, is only either as is performing dance or being a waitress. The contract does not include provisions concerning holidays or days off, and does not grant the artist the right to terminate the contract, unless in cases of natural disasters or political revolutions. The contract puts the woman under debt bondage right away. While all expenses have been paid by the recruiter, by the super nightclub owner, now she has to pay them back. And they're all written on the back of the contract, and both parties, her and the super nightclub owners, signed the expenses. But the exploitation does not end here. The super nightclub owner is in total control of the time and movement of the woman and keeps her isolated from the outside world. Artists are put in specific hotels licensed by the immigration authorities, and they cannot go without signing off on and off. Once the woman complains to the authorities, she's right away deported. Lebanese authorities do not want to show that prostitution is happening because it's illegal, and they want to make it the least visible. So she's deported without having the right to redress, without compensation, without anything. And this is clearly, this visa artist scheme is clearly against our anti-trafficking law in Lebanon. But it is still happening essentially because there's a demand for it, but also because it's money, it's very lucrative and profitable.
Well, I'll try to talk about policies, practices, and people's life, because I see them all as strictly interconnected, as a circle. And to start with, I would like to say that despite the advanced legal, international, and European anti-trafficking framework, still trafficking is neglected as it is treated, as interventions are being carried out in our states. If there is no identification, there is no possibility for social inclusion. If there is no social inclusion, identification only served a temporary, elusive relief. So we come to social inclusion, and social inclusion is simply not enough prioritized. It is somehow denied, for example, by the Dublin regulation, because as a refugee you can't settle where you might have better social inclusion opportunities because maybe you have relatives or acquaintances there. Social inclusion is frustrated also because of what I would call the Dublin refoulement. When migrants that contravened the Dublin regulation and based on that are sent back to the first arrival country without any risk assessment. And therefore, if, for example, they fled from the country, from the first arrival country, they fled the traffickers, they are sent back to them in their hands. And so not placing social inclusion on the horizon means that hosting countries might feel unsafe and they become hostile countries. And moreover, in certain countries, the presence of high numbers of displaced persons and refugees available, for example, for underpaid work, might weaken the social structure of the hosting country. And in certain cases, even making the local population more vulnerable also to trafficking and to exploitation. Social inclusion also means having tailor-made measures necessary to meet the needs of trafficked persons. For example, children on the move, because otherwise they go away from reception centers, centers and shelters after 2 minutes, or 2 hours, or 1 day. And social inclusion also means supporting access to the labor market. Otherwise, you don't have social inclusion. What we need, in fact, is, of course, that we have fully implemented anti-trafficking policies, because we have legislation, but implementation still needs to be developed. But we also need a policy shift, that is, having a harmonized system by which migration policies, anti-trafficking policies, social policies, and so on are conceived and implemented in a harmonized way.
One of the things that was discussed is about the criminal justice versus a human rights-based approach, and how those two things could be quite consistent with each other, that you could have that, providing that what criminal justice was focused on was on securing the rights and protections for the individuals concerned. But the problem came with migration control, because if migration control comes first, and so that criminal justice is really serving the interests of migration control first and foremost, and human rights are a sort of second best, then you inevitably end up not just with the contradictions such as Lisbeth Zornig being convicted of trafficking offences, but also you end up with the fact, the contradictions that it's actually the most vulnerable who end up being criminalised for participation in activities that get constructed as trafficking, even though you could argue that they were smuggling or facilitating movement in some way that was desired, consented for and wanted by the migrant concerned. All of which led us to be more suspicious, I think, about whether you could combine a human rights approach with migration controls than the question of whether you could combine it with criminal justice issues.
What kind of challenges do NGOs are facing in offering social services to victims and assistance to migrant workers? So, what kind of challenges are they facing? We're looking at the civil society. We individuate three as well. One is the difficulty of outreaching to victims. So to reach out to victims is, of course, it's a very difficult thing to do, especially because victims are, they refrain to talk about what they experienced. There's a lot of stigmatization that goes around. Another important factor is, of course, the one of funding of NGOs and non-governmental organizations, especially in times of tight national budgets and budget cuts. So this is something that across the board civil society is facing, restriction of budgets and funds to provide assistance services. And a third aspect we talk about is the reintegration of foreign victims to the countries of origin as well. You can imagine when a victim is individuated in a foreign country and is repatriated in the country of origin, there's a number of assistance measures that need to be taken, and that requires additional resources, needs additional mechanisms, skills, and this is something that the civil society, of course, it plays a key role in it, and one of the major challenges is to assist these victims, this particular vulnerable group, when they reintegrate in the country of origin.
So, coming back to the person has to have the possibility to choose. We have to place the person in the position to choose for his or for her life. This means empowerment, this means protection, and this also means that the person is granted the permit to stay and not to be criminalized or deported and so on. It's quite sad to have to highlight this, but still this is the case. And the person, putting the person in the position to choose, of course, also means to offer viable social inclusion, integration possibilities. And for all this process, trust is fundamental. Mm-hmm. Trust means also using, for example, in this system, cultural mediators, and also recognizing the role of NGOs, which in some countries might be an issue. And so NGOs should be included in the policy-making process as well. And this would also be a way of having migrants' voices, victims' voices listened to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Marco. I think this is a good final word. I will keep that in mind also for the last panel. Place the person in a position to choose. So the freedom to choose also related to mobility, freedom of movement, although, as we heard, free borders, we're still far away from that.